So the first thing I want to present on is if we go back to our paper that we did for world modeling and the Evergood regulator theorem, um, and you're familiar with the Evergood regulator theorem, which maybe some of you are and some of you aren't, you'll know that one of the things about the Evergood regulator theorem is that it's about good regulation. So what does good mean? It's such a subjective term. So in the paper, we kind of talk about what good is in the context of a world model, but also what good is in terms of, you know, so is good optimal? Is good good enough? Is good conforming to the things you want? Or is good the ability to deal with perturbations or disruptions or robustness, as we might call it in engineering? So there are a lot of things that are kind of subsumed under this term good. And Conant and Ashby, who are the people who developed DGRT, they weren't explicit about what good means, just that it's good. It does something, it's desirable. And so that's, maybe led to problems in terms of applying the Evergood regulator theorem. But there is one sort of concept that is very important for the regulator as opposed to, well, we have good, which means, I guess, optimal or adaptive or robust, anything that helps you keep regulation stable. And then the other concept is variety. So variety is, it's a little less subjective than good because we actually know that variety is when you have a diversity of things or when you have many different things that you're trying to deal with. And variety is sort of one of the keys to being good at regulation. And in fact, cognitive science hasn't really incorporated this idea of variety. It's, cognitive science, a lot of times, if you deal with something like attention, or you deal with something like memory, or you deal with something like some of the other areas that cognitive scientists think about, they often think of a very homogeneous model. And it's like, an idealized model or something where variety is not important. And of course, but we know that the world is full of variety, right? You have varieties of things. And that's, in fact, one of the key aspects. We think about it sort of as a implicit thing. One of the key aspects of machine learning. If you have a training set that has, say, cars, you want to train your model on as many different types of cars as possible so that model can generalize. If you train it all on the same car, it'll recognize that car, and then if it sees something different, it won't recognize it as a car. It'll reject that prediction, and you'll have an error. So your model in that case is only as good as the variety that you have. If you have more variety, if you have a greater amount of variety, then the more generalizable your model. And thus it is with human categorization as well, or animal categorization, where you have, if you're introduced to a wide variety of different varieties of a type, if you think about it in that way, or maybe a category. So if you only saw one type of car, you would see other types of car as maybe not a car. Or this happens a lot in cultural categorization, where you make distinctions between different things based on sort of their importance or their functionality or something like that. So sometimes, some cultures have 50 different words for like snow or like a certain type of fruit or whatever, and other cultures can make do with just one word for that same thing because they have it's a different sort of level of importance. They make distinctions between the varieties, and those varieties are important. Sometimes they're less important. If they're less important, that's fine, but then you can't make those kind of distinctions from sort of nothing. You have to have the cultural toolkit available to you. So variety plays a really important role in regulation, in cognition, and so forth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about variety as it stands in cybernetics, and then I'm going to talk about this paper that is about requisite complexity, which is, or actually another paper, that's the second paper, and then I'm going to talk about a new paper that sort of formalizes variety as a mathematical concept, and it's kind of taking off on Conant and Ashby's work. So let's do the first one here. This is the Wikipedia article on variety, parentheses, cybernetics. So, this is kind of the cybernetics treatment of variety. So in cybernetics, the term variety denotes the total number of distinguishable elements of a set. So this is basically, if you know anything about information theory, it's very closely aligned with how information is thought of in information theory. So in information theory, we usually have an ensemble, which is a set, and then we have different states, and we measure those states. We measure the distribution within that ensemble, and we get our information. If our ensemble contains a bunch of things that are in the same state, then we have a very low level of information. If we have a bunch of different states in our ensemble, we have a very high level of information. Phrased in terms of variety, variety is high information, and a lack of variety is low information. So that's how they think about variety. It's very tied to information theory, and in fact, it probably did come from Shannon's conception of information theory. So this is all kind of intellectually connected. In fact, they say here, variety is used in cybernetics as an information theory that is easily related to deterministic finite automata, and less formally as a conceptual tool for thinking about organization, regulation, and stability. But in the EGRT, of course, we're using variety as that latter thing. So W. Ross Ashby developed the term variety to extend his analysis of machines to their set of possible behaviors. Ashby says, the word variety in relation to a set of distinguishable elements will be used to mean either A, the number of distinct elements, or B, the logarithm to the base 2 of the number, and the context indicating the sense used. So it's basically information theory at base 2, log base 2. And, we're thinking, I guess, about bits in this case. So that's why we're doing the base 2. We're measuring variety in bits. So again, like I said, if your machine has states A, B, C, D available to it, and you get a sequence A, B, C, 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 D, then that sequence A, B, C, 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 D has a variety of 4. And it's just taking all the available states and it's generating a sequence and it's seeing how many of those states are represented in the sequence and at what probability. So it's basically information theory. And then the same things about information theory hold true for the measurement of that variety. And now this next part, since the number of distinguishable elements depends on both the observer and the set, so it's actually now they're bringing in the observer, the second order cybernetics. The observer and his powers of discrimination may have to be specified if the variety is to be well defined. So this is, again, being able to see variety and classify it correctly and have categories for the variety. So if we had no, distinction between different shades of blue, we might just put all different shades of blue in one category. And thus you have less variety in terms of blue, you have fewer states, and so there's not as much of a distinction between those states, even though there's an underlying variety. So if you think about this computationally, it's like the difference between sort of a fixed automata and some sort of hidden Markov model, where you're trying to find new states or hidden states. So this is a problem of hidden state, where the observer or the person who's classifying things doesn't have the classes, or the classes they have hold a bunch of different types of things within them. So there's variety within those states, so that can be unlocked. And so this is a problem where, again, if we think about this in the real world, some cultures have many different words for, say, like different types of snow or different shades of blue, whereas other cultures don't. And so those cultures with all those different terms have unlocked that variety, and they can take advantage of it. So that's kind of thinking about the basic aspect of variety. And then talks about the different laws, because they like to create laws around things in cybernetics. The law of experience and the law of requisite variety. The law of experience refers to the observation of the variety of states exhibited by a deterministic machine in isolation cannot increase. Then the set of identical machines fed the same inputs cannot exhibit increasing variety of states and instead tend to synchronize. So this is almost like kind of describing what we might call nowadays model decay, where if you have a model upstream, you have a certain number of states available to it. Like, so say we do like a machine learning problem where we have someone who trains a model, and then that model maybe trains another model, or things get passed from that original model downstream to other models. The original model is where all the variety is kind of defined, and then the subsequent models are constrained sort of by that categorization of variety. So it can't generate new variety. If it does, maybe it hallucinates, and it's kind of useless because it's not operating on any sort of principle. So upstream is where all the variety is created, and ultimately that's due to the observer, who's the person who's creating the states in the first place. Now, it's an interesting question as to, like, if you had a generative model, whether or not you could create new variety based on patterns in the data. And of course, we do that with machine learning because we do try to find hidden states or try to find relationships between things. And that is kind of uncovering some of this hidden variety. But the law of experience basically says that you have sort of this experience with variety, and you can't just kind of feed a machine variety and expect to get more variety out of it. There's a tendency to synchronize around the same sort of answer. So this is what they call a decay of variety. So a deterministic transformation cannot increase the variety of a set. As a result, an observer's uncertainty about the state of the machine either remains constant or decreases with time. So this is, again, the observer kind of gets to know the machine, or the system kind of gets to know the variety, and it sorts things into these categories, and it becomes more predictive over time. But sometimes that, if you don't make the correct assumption of variety in the first place, there's a lot of hidden variety that gets subsumed under that. So this has a lot of ties to machine learning and how we do, how we create labels, how we train our models, and things like that. It also brings up another set of questions about generative models and how it can create new categories for things or uncover things that we didn't really think about. So there are a lot of connections there. But so there's this law of experience, and then there's this law of requisite variety. So the law of requisite variety is that if you have a system and you have a regulator of that system, so say you have a regulator that wants to control, say, something with respect to a system's diversity or its variety, So say you have like a closed loop control. You might have like a brain machine interface where you have a brain that generates states and you have a classifier that tries to classify those states. The brain having many more categories than the classifier because you can only observe a certain set of states from the brain. That regulator then is limited in terms of how it can regulate the output. Some systems have this one-to-one mapping where they have every state available to it. So the regulator has every state that the system has, and that therefore that regulator can match the system at any given time. And that's what we call perfect regulation, meaning it can always respond in a like manner, and it's never like decoupled. The system and the regulator are never decoupled. But sometimes there are disturbances that occur. Sometimes there are states that are generated by a brain that a classifier can't match. And so in that case, the two things become decoupled and the regulation becomes not good. So that's kind of what requisite variety is, that the regulator, the thing that's trying to match the behavior of the system, doesn't have enough states or doesn't have enough information to get the right outcome or get a good outcome. And Ashby used a two-player game to model this, where one player is the disruption or the disturbance, and another one is the regulator. So this is something that Ashby thought about a lot, and it's basically where you're trying to match the behaviors of something that you don't necessarily understand or is maybe stochastic. So this can be stated in bits of information theory. So it's very much tied to that. And then, of course, there's this Poisson McKelvey update to the law of requisite variety called the law of requisite complexity, which we'll look at in a minute. So this holds that in order to be efficaciously adaptive, meaning that it's good at being adaptive or something, the internal complexity of a system must match the external complexity it confronts. So if there's a lot of complexity in the world, your regulator must match that. And this happens to be very relevant to world models, because if we have a world model of a system for, like, say, a large language model or a machine learning model to draw from, that world model has to incorporate enough of the states of the world or the system to allow for those models to respond properly. That's kind of what we're getting at in our paper in terms of EGRT and world models, is that the world model is basically the thing that's going to match the state of the predictive state with the world, and it'd be a good surrogate for the world. So it's something that the model could draw from to become better at predicting things and representing information. So this is kind of thinking about, this is also thinking about kind of moving this in the direction of complexity theory. And so this is where this law of requisite variety has gone. It's gone from sort of this set of experiments that Ashby was doing to a number of works by Stafford Beer and Frank George and other people, but also into the world of complexity theory. Okay. And of course, there's some other ties to like chaos theory and other things, but we won't talk about that. There are also ties to the Cybersyn project. Okay, so this is requisite complexity. This is a paper that was published, Foundational Papers in Complexity Science. Requisite Complexity, a Contemporary View of Cybernetic Control and Communication. This is by James Crutchfield, who's at Santa Fe. And the idea is that this paper, the ever good regulator of a system must be a model of that system, is very much rooted in information theory, but also is tied to nonlinear dynamics. And there isn't as much emphasis on that in Ashby's work, but is important nonetheless for that area. In this way, connecting the original historical effort to the modern, today's complex systems research can be appreciated as a revival and extension of Norbert Wiener's cybernetics. That's interesting. That cybernetics is sort of the precursor of complexity theory, or one of them. So, I think this is just a summary of the paper. This is an excerpt. Um, so basically, thinking about this idea of the law of requisite variety, we're thinking about that in terms of complex systems and how we can characterize those. And then they kind of bring up Ed Ott's work in chaotic dynamics and Cross and Greenside's work in self-organization. And so these come to mind as example of emergent phenomena that make complex systems supremely challenging. And it's a restatement, essentially, of the Evergood regulator theorem. And that you have a system that's very complex, that's hard to understand, that's maybe incomplete in terms of its understanding. So in chaos theory, as well as in emergence, we have a system that does something that we can't say for sure exactly how it happened. We can only sort of approximate the process by which something happened. And the same thing probably holds true for a regulator that doesn't have access to every state of a system. So that regulator is us as the observer trying to explain what that system is doing. We don't have access to every state, but we can just kind of describe that process in terms of the states we have available to us. So that that description is lossy in the sense that it's not a perfect map, but we can do well enough to at least describe it, hopefully. We can do that with mathematics, but the mathematics is incomplete. We can do that with simulation, but simulation doesn't give us the exact rules of what's happening. So that's kind of a nice connection between complexity theory and the Evergood regulator theorem. And then the third paper I want to talk about here is this paper by Alexander Siegenfeld and Unir Bar-Yam. And this is on a formal definition of scale-dependent complexity and the multi-scale law of requisite variety. So they are actually updating the law of requisite variety for complexity theory, or for use in terms of a complex systems setting. This is from the journal Entropy. So the abstract reads, Ashby's law of requisite variety allows a comparison of systems with their environments, providing a necessary but not sufficient condition for system efficacy. A system must possess at least as much complexity as any set of environmental behaviors that require distinct responses from the system. However, to account for the dependence of a system's complexity on the level of detail or scale of its description, so we have different scales of description. We have a coarse grain scale, a fine grain scale, a finer grain scale. And because we have those differences of scale, we have differences in the number of states that are used to describe something. So if you look at something in a coarse grained approximation, you don't have all the states available to you, but you can approximate them. In a fine-grained system, you have access to those states, and you can give a more refined description, but you also need access to that coarse grain scale, maybe to describe things like emergence. So we want to have a multi-scale generalization of Ashby's law, because remember, we want to have this regulator interact with the system, but the regulator can't just simply be at one scale or another. We need to have a regulator that can operate on both scales, on the coarse grain scale and the fine grain scale. There are benefits to both, and we need that for something like describing emergence. We define a class of complexity profiles, which are complexity as a function of scale. That is the first to our knowledge to exhibit a multi-scale law of requisite variety. This formalism provides a characterization of multi-scale complexity and generalizes the law of requisite variety in a single constraint on a system, on systems behavior. So requisite variety is a single constraint. And this leads us to a class of multi-scale constraints. We show that these complexity profiles satisfy a sum rule, which reflects a trade-off between smaller and larger degrees of freedom. And we extend our results to subdivided systems and systems with a continuum of components. So again, this law of requisite variety means that our regulator needs to have access to all the states of the system. Now, of course, we maybe need to have access to both coarse grain and fine grain states, or the number of states that exist at different scales, which of course varies if you're dealing with something like an emergent system, or if you're doing something like a multi-scale system, like say a biological system where you have cells and you have a biochemistry, and you even have like a higher scale, like a set of populations or behaviors. So you need to be able to describe the states at all those scales. And your regulator needs to have access, or maybe you need to have multiple regulators that can deal with that. So that's what they're getting at. And then, of course, you have a lot of times in systems, you have subdivided systems that interact. So sometimes you have modular systems where you have different parts of a system. So you're only maybe accessing one module of a system, and you need to access multiple modules to make sense of the system. Or you have a continuum of components where, and remember, Ashby conceptualized the Evergood regulator theorem as a discrete exercise where you're creating discrete states that are amenable to information theory. But sometimes you have a continuum of things where your states are continuous, which doesn't necessarily map well to that metaphor that he used from information theory, and you need other tools to be able to do that. So this is basically about scale-dependent complexity and how we deal with that with the Evergood regulator theorem. So they have this set of possible behaviors, and possible behaviors vary by scale. So when you look at something at the smallest scale, you get different types of behaviors than if you look at it at the intermediate scale and at the large scale, or the sort of the higher order scale. You also have this graph that they give about insufficient systems variety versus sufficient systems variety. And for insufficient, when we have an example of insufficient system variety, that is when we have environmental variety that comes in different shapes over here. And then we have these different interfaces. So that you can think of this as like ligands and receptors in biology, where you have different molecules that have to fit into a receptor. And if it can't fit into the receptor, then it can't signal downstream. But if it can fit into the receptor, then it can signal downstream and you get an effect. In this case, we have environmental variety as a series of shapes, and then they fit into the circle. So you can see that these top three figures, or these top three shapes, fit into their corresponding circle. If they're floating around in a soup and they bind with these circles, I mean, the square won't be able to bind with this blue Pac-Man-like circle, but it can bind with another receptor, and so it tries to just find that receptor and match it. So you have the states, and you have the states in the environment, you have the states at the receptor level. That is where you have a system and you have a regulator, and they can match perfectly. But in this last case, you have a hexagon that's trying to bind into another square, and you can't do that. So this hexagonal ligand or set of ligands have nowhere to map to in terms of the receptors. So this is a lack of variety on the end of these receptors. This is the systems variety that's lacking with respect to the environmental variety. There's a whole class of things that can't be represented. Whereas if we have sufficient systems variety, we have a receptor for every type of environmental variant. And this is actually an interesting question in evolution because there is a whole literature, or like a little tiny literature maybe, on lock and key systems, which are one example being ligands and receptors. So you have a bunch of ligands that have to have very strict specificity with respect to their receptors. And the idea is, did they co-evolve? How did they co-evolve? And this is a question of variety, because you have this variety of ligands and then you end up with this variety of receptors, and they kind of have to co-evolve in order to have some informational value. And so how did that happen? That's kind of one of the things that kind of grows out of this experiment, at least as I see it. But this illustrates, I think, very well what happens when you don't have sufficient system variety. And then, the paper goes on and talks about how we can generalize Ashby's law to multiple components. We can actually extend information theory to look at mutual information. We can look at conditional information and things like that. And then this looks at how we have different systems components of various sizes, how we can account for that, and then fit that into that model of requisite variety. So there's a lot of conceptual stuff in this paper, a lot of good mathematics, and just extending this out from this idea, this notion of good regulation to sort of a complex systems view of different states and different scales of analysis. And so this describes coarse graining versus this fine grained description and the differences here. And then finally, we have these different types of partitioning systems or different types of partitioning strategies to sort of map between scales.